civilization, or the system as we know it, at its highest scale, is essentially a business or corporation. What people refer to as the New World Order is simply a reorganization of that business structure in the same way that any normal multinational corporation would engage in actions that reorganize its business structure so that it could do any number of things, streamline its efficiency, cut costs, etc. Now, obviously, that metaphor can't be directly applied to the system itself due to the fact that there's more than just money or profit as the primary goal. Obviously, there is a certain element of control that is more important than any amount of money that this system extracts from us. Looking at the system in this practical way as the reorganization of a corporation, what we're going through right now is a phase in the reorganization where the system doesn't need as much energy as it did in the past. What do I mean by that? Well, first, a big part of this is the automation and robotization of the larger quote-unquote economy. If you do any sort of cursory research into the future of automation, you'll see them telling everyone that there are going to be close to 100 million jobs lost as a result of the impact of automation on the economy in the next 20 or 30 years. We're not talking about a long period of time here. This is going to have a significant impact on the need for a middle class. You see, the system, as a sort of energy regulator, goes through phases where it needs, like I said, more energy or less energy. But if you apply that to the class system, it goes through phases where it needs more of a middle class and less of a middle class, where it returns closer to a serf-lord arrangement. Especially in the Western world, with the introduction of the Magna Carta, which was kind of the first shift towards a more middle-class setup, which obviously can be traced all the way through to America and the 20th century especially, and just in general the Industrial Revolution, which was a necessary function of creating America as the empire that would spread the larger infrastructure around the world to the areas that had not yet adopted the system. And obviously this was done through force in many cases, and really this was just a continuation of the original colonization program that had been run for hundreds of years before that. So now, after the Industrial Revolution and the buildup of the West especially, the technology has reached the stage where there is not as much of a need for as many middle-class individuals that would build up the wealth of all of these countries and, by extension, build up its technological abilities. So now we're in a phase where that is going to be eliminated, essentially. This is kind of why there's a lot of talk out there about universal basic income now kind of floating around. Is because 30 years from now, there's going to be a significant decrease in the amount of jobs available to people that would traditionally support a middle-class existence. For example, just take self-driving vehicles. If in 30 years there are self-driving vehicles to the point where no one drives their own car anymore, well, that's going to destroy entire industries that support middle-class families. Truck drivers will be completely eliminated. Delivery drivers will be completely eliminated. You can take this further all the way to the service industry, where if the Amazon model of the supply chain continues to grow at the rate that it is growing, we might reach this stage where there's no brick and mortar, as they refer to them, stores in existence anymore. They might just be distribution centers for online orders. And sure, maybe you could go to one of these places still and pick up something that you ordered, or maybe even buy something even if you didn't order anything. But you see how that will potentially eliminate all of the service industry workers who are given jobs by these stores. You can see little examples of this, like in grocery stores, and how self-checkout aisles are growing and growing and growing. They keep taking up more and more space. Will it get to the point where there's no workers at the grocery stores anymore? Would it be fully automated to the point where robots are going around stacking the shelves? Or, like I said, will it get to the point where everything is just delivered to you and then there's no need for those stores anymore? I mean, you see what I'm getting at here? This is going to be a tremendously impactful thing that's going to happen. So from the perspective of the larger system, imagine you are in the position of running this business, as it were, and sure, you are behind a lot of the things that are pointed to as reasons for why this is happening, because it is a part of your end goal to create a self-regulating cybernetic feedback loop system. As a part of creating that system, there is simply not as much of a need for as many workers as there was in the previous version of the system, which obviously was the Industrial Revolution, as I mentioned, and you obviously need a lot of workers to power all of those machines and factories and build everything, right? And that's why the agrarian culture was transformed into the urban city culture, and why the farms were purposefully deserted, or at least conditions were set so it made people think that they had no choice but to move to the cities. And that's how the whole city thing began in the first place. And now we've reached the stage where it's been built up enough that there will only be required maintenance of what's been built. And as the robotization and automation industries continue to impact everything, there just isn't as much of a need for the workers that there was in the past. And then on top of that, right, you have the cultural eugenics aspects of it impacting the birth rates, in addition to just a higher standard of living that, you know, successive generations in the Western countries have experienced, because it was a part of the plan for them to grow very wealthy so that all of that wealth could be extracted and exported to areas of the world that need to be built up as a part of the worldwide regulated system where everyone's on the same playing field. And this is how you can see the corollary, where they're extracting energy from the West and they're putting it into the East. Where in China, for example, the middle class is actually being built up there. They are coming from a place of serf-lord relationship, and they are establishing an actual middle class in China to sort of level the teeter-totter, as it were. But obviously the main trend in the whole thing is that just in general, the number of people that are needed to self-perpetuate the free energy device they are trying to create through the reorganization of the system itself is going to require less people to operate it. Or at least a lot fewer people than were required to bring it into fruition. And this is going to have significant impacts on the structure of society and the standard of living of everyone that exists within it. This is what free trade was designed to do from its inception. And sure, it sounded good at the time, but free trade was designed to open borders For example, the North American Free Trade Agreement. That agreement destroyed so many sectors of the Mexican economy and its ability to employ its own citizens. Once the borders were opened and all of the multinational corporations in America that have cheaper costs and therefore cheaper goods were able to go into Mexico and displace all of the competition there, well, it resulted in a bunch of people who didn't have jobs anymore. And so they became desperate. And then they said, well, I'm going to America, I guess. And this is the same thing that they did in Europe with Northern Africa. They created the conditions in Northern Africa so that there was unrest. And then you have all of these refugees. I mean, you can look at the Ebola outbreak as a prime example of this. And then they create the infrastructure for the refugees to be brought into the Western European nations. And that's how it's done. And then Europe already had its own open borders through the European Union, where if you get a passport or become a citizen in one of these countries, then you have direct access to all of the other countries that are members of the EU. Multiculturalism is simply a code word for a reorganization of the labor force and culture of cities. And suburbs, for that matter. Just the megacity template in general. This is why Barbara Specter gave that infamous quote about how Europe would have to accept multiculturalism or it would not survive.
I think there's a resurgence of anti-Semitism because at this point in time, Europe has not yet learned how to be multicultural. And I think we're going to be part of the throes of that transformation, which must take place. Europe is not going to be the monolithic societies that they once were in the last century. Jews are going to be at the center of that. It's a huge transformation for Europe to make. They are now going into a multicultural mode, and Jews will be resented because of our leading role. But without that leading role and without that transformation, Europe will not survive.
And looking at it from their perspective, running the business or the corporation, as it were, that's all that she meant when she was saying that. She says, look, here are all the trends that we have created that are leading to this situation that Europe is now in with declining birth rates and obviously another aspect of the multicultural narrative and that program that's being implemented is that if some of these Western nations were able to stay in their traditional makeup, societally speaking, culturally speaking, it would be much more difficult to disrupt the economic system in the way that they are disrupting it. It would take a much longer amount of time for those cities to be changed if it was the traditional society that those countries have known for thousands of years, as opposed to America, which is only 300 years old and is a melting pot anyway. So America is much easier to change in that respect. Because when you disrupt the culture, then you make it much more easy to implement new things that the people that are refugees or immigrating from other countries that aren't accustomed to that standard of living and don't know the history of that nation and don't know anything that's been going on, well, they will very easily adopt new things, as it were, that won't be so easily adopted by people that have been there for thousands of years, like I said, generationally. And more importantly, as they are attempting to implement all of these changes, it's all about giving us someone to blame for the reason that our standard of living is deteriorating. That's the key. Because as it continues to deteriorate, there's going to be more and more agitation more and more energy that needs to be discharged and dissipated without it actually impacting any of the agendas that are being put in place. And the way that they do that is the same way they've always done it. Give them an election to blow some steam off in, give them some media stories to direct some anger towards a certain group of individuals. I mean, right, they've been doing this to the white and black communities, setting them at odds with each other for decades. I mean, do you think it's an accident that they elected a president who wants to build a wall along the Mexican border in America? Given what I just went over? Of course not. And then on top of that, do you think it's an accident that the other side has now elected an individual with the last name Cortez, who is, I'm not sure what her nationality technically is, but she looks very Mexican. Do you think it's an accident that they have her now leading the charge on the left for all of the things that they want to change in America as far as the green agenda goes? Of course not. It's all about dividing people. You see, going further with this, the system itself was created through colonization. And initially this was done via the ocean. The colonizers traveled by ship and they colonized certain areas of the world that had not yet adopted its system. And this was done for a variety of reasons, but most notably of which was to acquire resources that would power the system. And resources are both from the earth. The lands that they wanted to colonize had certain natural resources that they wanted, or likewise by acquiring slave labor or more people to power their system. And this is seen through how the law of the sea or admiralty law formed the basis of many of the legal systems that we know today. For example, the thing that we use to exchange value between ourselves is referred to as money or currency. And obviously water is a form of currency. You have a current in a river, a current in the ocean. And the current in a river, for example, is held in by the river banks. So you see the analogy to the financial system where you have the currency being routed through banks. In a sense, it's an electronic circuit, a battery, as it were. And at certain times, the battery becomes low and it needs to be charged with energy. And then, of course, you have what we refer to as charging for things in the general economy. You charge something to your bank account. The people are, or more accurately, the slaves, are a resource that charges the system from time to time. But at certain periods, the battery is fully charged, as it were. And so the system needs to consolidate and restructure itself to better reflect the direction that it is heading. The New World Order is just consolidating currency. That's all it is. In every way that you can take that literally and metaphorically.